I just wanted to begin just with some context for my comments. One, I come from the Central and Eastern European region, which really touches on the conversation that we had near the end of this morning about some differences. There's some really significant differences. Many of these comments have come in a number of times about the situation in India, which is quite different than Western Europe. But the reality in Central and Eastern Europe is also quite different. And so addressing a number of the issues and a lot of the comments this morning, I find myself in a quite different context there. And I will touch upon that several times. And of course, the other one is that I'm coming from the perspective of citizens, because our Citizens Network is trying to deal with promoting the bottoms-up side of this. So that will be the context. I was thinking of two things that I just wanted to say about it. One was that there was a sociologist, Ralph Dahrendorf, who wrote after the fall of communism a quite interesting comment that he said, it's going to take about 6 months to convert the governmental sector, to create the capacity to change the governments. He said it will take about 6 years to deal with the economic system transition. It will take 60 years to deal with civil society, which I think is an important perspective that is sometimes lost in all of this and the investment that's needed around all of that.
600 years for success.
Yeah, in the seventh revolution, yeah, exactly. The other context for me, I grew up in the U.S. as well, but I never heard this definition of democracy, and I'm not sure why. Well, I know why we don't talk about it, but I came across it recently that Benjamin Franklin described democracy for me in this very interesting way. He described it as two wolves and a lamb deciding what to have for dinner. And I thought, wow, for me it was just really striking to me that somebody that was one of the founding fathers of American democracy had this insight about the dynamics that's there. Now, we don't like to talk about democracy, I think, in that context, but he went on to add that liberty is an armed lamb contesting the vote. And I like that too. It's very much related to what I feel is a lot of the work that we're trying to do in Central and Eastern Europe. And I maybe would just already say one of the conclusions. I think maybe IT is helping to create some of the arms for the lamb, the citizen, in this process. So just the context for our use. I mean, one of the things that I struggled a bit with this question was just the context about how we use it. There is a much more limited use. Fundamentally, it is because participation doesn't exist very much. It's not really valued in the same way. Hearing you describe it this morning in the context here is just quite a different context. On both the side of elected officials, we don't have many of you, people like you, Peter, in elected office there. People run for a very different reason. It's changing. It will continue to change. But the sense of the kind of mission that you enter into this process is not very typical of elected officials there. So we don't have an environment that really talks about we really want to have participation. But the truth is, on the other side, citizens aren't prepared to enter into it either. I mean, citizens under socialism were not allowed to. And when 1 in 6 people was an informant, people didn't trust. And it's just hard to imagine really what that was like. So a different kind of social network was created in that context. And that's what came forward. That's the 60-year process that Dahrendorf is talking about too. Because that stuff doesn't change. I've told several of you that I had read this interesting book several years back that a friend sent me called The Weakness of Civil Society in Post-Communist Europe. And the author is describing this process, and it helped me to put some concepts and labels about this process of something that he calls a post-communist legacy. And he describes some of these ways in which people created these units with each other that helped people to bond together. And they were much more based around family and about close friendships. It was a survival technique. I mean, people needed to do that because you couldn't trust other people in the same way. So it became a very important kind of mechanism. And one of the aspects of it is that people were forced to be members and forced to volunteer. We will all go out and take the potatoes from the patch today. So there's a real resistance to that. I got remarried to this lovely woman who's the founder or the first director of the Community Foundation, the first one in the whole region. Significant NGO leader, civil society leader. And I came home and told her about this book, and I said, it says that people don't want to be members of the organization. And she talks about how social capital is the foundation of their work, etc. And she said to me, I'd never want to be a member of an organization. Oh my goodness, I'm living with one, It is fundamental to the reality there. When we are bringing citizens groups together there, people say, I don't want to be a member of something. They're willing to be a sympathizer, but it has all kinds of connotations about what it means to be a member, the requirements of it, and there's all kinds of issues about leadership. So the whole foundation of building the civil society is just a different context there. And the other reality that is commented on is that there's a huge gap between citizens and civil society. Most civil society groups that get set up there is an emerging, flourishing kind of civil society, US particularly, but European governments help support a lot of that. But they're very small kind of groups. Boards are 3 to 5 people that they trust and can work with, and they don't have memberships. People don't want to be members of them. And citizens are really left out of this whole process. So there's this huge gap. And citizens, on the other hand, don't trust civil society because they don't know really what it is. So it creates a whole different kind of reality for us when we start talking about all these issues. Trust, membership, gap between citizens, etc. So there's several quotes that I have in here. But one of the things that we did was to take a look at this whole issue about civil society and democracy at the local level. And we've completed the first phase of it. We only have EU countries in here because the EU is the source of this. We want to do a second phase, and then we're going to do a broader publishing of this. Because there were 10, I think, interesting and important conclusions from this. But the major conclusion from the study was that despite this gap and all of the issues that are there, we came to the conclusion that there is the one overarching observation is that there's an enormous democratic potential exists where citizens take direct and continuous action to influence the development of their communities. So there's a real paradox in our region. Citizens are willing to get involved. There is this enormous potential, but it needs to be developed in a way. And so 10 challenges came out of this, and I'm not going to go through each one, but the fundamental and most important one was empowerment. It's been used a lot. You used it in the questions that you asked us. You would never hear that from local officials in our region about these issues. So just the fact that you're talking about that for me is impressive. But this issue about empowerment, though, for citizens, the IT tools, et cetera, can be a part of it. But fundamentally, citizens really need to get this experience of being empowered. And all that means that it's okay to actually even have a meeting. It's okay to take a position on something. But there's a whole lot of skills that are needed with that. And there's an investment that's going to be needed to help people to get into that process. Motivation. Why do people do this? And what we find is that oftentimes we have a lot of these kind of, not as dramatic, but the Stuttgart 21 kinds of campaigns. Citizens oftentimes are engaged because of something being proposed. They're not consulted on the front end typically in our region. So the only space that's left for them is to complain on the back end. But there is a whole other set of issues of motivation that need to be addressed for the long term. And what we found is that citizens that do get engaged oftentimes maybe on a protest basis, many of them are interested in talking about some longer term issues, but it needs to be mined as well. Community is another interesting issue. It's a changing issue for us because community was not a part of the emphasis in Central and Eastern Europe. People didn't form together around community. As I said, they formed more around families and some other things. So we're starting to just rebuild community. And it raises a number of different kinds of interesting issues and complications for us. I think in Western Europe there's a different kind of reality about community, but I think for many of us it's a kind of a continual process though. It changes, the nature of that community maybe changes, and the roles in which people need to play in that regard. Infrastructure we talked a lot about this morning, and some of the things that need to be done to make this work, even the rules and guidelines about it. Power dynamics. We oftentimes don't like to talk about power in relationship to this, but it's important to realize that there are some people that have power and some others that don't, and how to address some of those kinds of issues. The approach you made, a lot of comments about this whole issue, about how you ask the questions and how you do it is very important. External resources, legacies. The issues about culture and legacies, they're really different about this whole issue. We were just chatting at lunch about the role the church, for example, has played. In the country where Laura and I grew up, Ingrid and I grew up, churches play a major role in that regard. In Central and Eastern Europe, they don't. They don't even talk any words about social justice. Much of the countries like Poland and Slovakia, very Catholic countries, but missed all of Vatican II. So they're still talking about charity. But there's also legacies about totalitarianism, authoritarianism, etc. Cooperation. For us, it's even really just very basic, simple things of people learning to cooperate within their own neighborhood, and then to extend those out to connect with other people so that they can. And a third level then is with local authorities. But it is a third level, and it's even sometimes very problematic for us. And then democracy is another one of these places where the history in Central and Eastern Europe, our values, our legacies about this are quite different, and they are different than in Western Europe, and they are in India as well. So I think that the need to deepen these kinds of things is really essential. So 4 recommendations from me. First one is, we've been working with the Council of Europe. They've got a very interesting document, the first one that's really been developed by the Conference of INGOs, the Code of Good Practice of Civil Participation. I think when local authorities can adopt these and start making it real, what's nice is that it uses the latter participation like you introduced as one part of it. Our members have found this to be a really helpful and useful document. I'm not sure that it's written enough in the context of local authorities. So we'd be interested in your suggestions or any ideas that you have to make it more relevant for local authorities. But I think adopting it would be helpful, and we've used it actually for the last 2 years to promote with our members. I think this whole issue about keeping empowerment as the center, but the point I want to raise about this is the need to invest in that. I'm not sure where all of that investment comes from, but it's essential, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, but I think even in Western Europe, and for sure in India. We've got to invest to let citizens do this. This doesn't just happen magically, and IT tools aren't going to just suddenly make this work either. People need to have real experiences of their power and what a difference it can make. There's an issue about building capacity within the institutions. And the last one I would just suggest is that you export what you're doing here. This is really special. The fact that you're even asking these questions is really wonderful. And we would welcome you in Central and Eastern Europe, for sure. Thanks.
You.